This document is for free publication. It is for the purpose of those interested parties to further their information in the Philadelphia experiment. Please feel free to upload this document to any BBS you wish. Please do not add or delete from this document. Present it in its entirety without alterations. If you have proof this document is not in its entirety, please submit to address at the end of this document for proper revisions. This document was transcribed from a videotape. I received the tape on or about May or June 1990. After watching and reviewing the tape over a dozen times, I showed the tape to other friends, and they liked me, were very amazed. Some believed and some didn't. Now you can make your decision. ALFRED Bielek is one of the survivors of the Philadelphia experiment. Several of the names and places that Mr. Bielek mentioned could not be spelled correctly due to audio levels and mumbling. Of course there were a lot of places and things I have never heard of, and have no idea of how to spell them. I have tried to research some of this to make sure that all was correct. Also, some of the words may sound a little strange, improper English, and double words and sentences. This document is exactly as it was spoken during the time of the conference. Text cleaned up, as mentioned above, by Rick Anderson. October 92. This conference was conducted at the Moose on Metroplex in Dallas, Texas, the USO meeting. The date of this conference was January 13, 1990. The speaker's name is ALFRED Bielek, and this is how he explained the beginning and the so-called end of the experiment. Host, ALFRED Bielek is our speaker tonight, and I heard him at the USO conference in Phoenix in September, and I think it was pretty much agreed that he was the most interesting of any of the speakers, at least on subject material. So there hasn't been anyone that I know of that was actually involved in the Philadelphia experiment that was still around to tell you about it. And he is. So I think this one is a really exciting program. Now there are some tie-ins with UFOs in a sense in that, well, I will let him tell you a little bit about that. But one of the projects that he was working on is still highly classified, and it did involve some UFOs, and he really can't talk about that one as much tonight. He might just briefly touch on it. But I think it's real interesting that there's so much government secrecy around this, as much as there has been around UFOs, and the government has denied that this one has ever happened. So just in that relationship, I think it is very interesting, and it certainly has a tie-in with the things that we discuss here in our group. So with that, I introduce ALFRED Bielek. The Philadelphia Experiment Announcement. My name is ALFRED Bielek. I am a survivor of the Philadelphia Experiment. I am going to ask before really starting, out of the people who are here, how many of you really know what the Philadelphia Experiment, so-called, was really all about? I don't see very many hands going up. So probably the second question is a little bit superfluous. How many of you have any ideas to whether this experiment actually started in the war years? That is, World War I, say 41-42. How many of you think it started then? Very few are knowledgeable about that. A few hands go up. Or who may think it started earlier? Well, the ones who say earlier are correct. It actually had its genesis in 1931 to 1932, in a strange little windy city called Chicago, Illinois. At that time there had been, through the 20s and early 30s, a lot of speculation in the popular literature, meaning scientific popular literature like popular science, popular mechanics, Science Illustrated on the subjects of invisibility, trying to make an object disappear, or a person disappear, or even teleportation. I guess the people at that time in their writing thought that maybe we were close to it, in the terms of a scientific accomplishment, but there was a great deal of speculation, and very little if anything was ever done about it. About that time in 31, some people decided maybe it was about time to do something about it, and they got together at the University of Chicago. The three principals involved were Dr. Nikola Tesla, Dr. John Hutchinson and Dean of the University of Chicago, later Chancellor, and Dr. Kurtenauer, who was an Austrian physicist, who came from Austria and was on staff at the University of Chicago. They did a little research. A feasibility study type thing at that time, did not accomplish very much, at that particular moment, in that period. A little bit later, the entire project was moved to the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton. The Institute of Advanced Studies itself was an interesting organization. It is not part of the university system, it is not part of Princeton. It exists on Princeton property, but is an independent entity. It was funded in 1933, under whose auspices, or for what purpose, can't really say, other than someone wanted an institute for very advanced studies, postdoctoral research and this type of thing. Among the first people to join were such interesting and well-known people as Albert Einstein. I won't go into Albert Einstein's history, because he's too well known, but he joined the staff in 1933. He was of course from Bonn, Germany, and after he left Germany in 1930 some of the biographies said 1933, but it was in 1930 he came to the United States, and went to Pasadena, CA. He was teaching at Caltech. He was there for about 3 years, and was invited to join the institute, in which he did in 1933, and he remained there until his death. Einstein's principal function was of theoretical physicist, the theoretical man, strictly mathematics, in the area of physics. Well known of course for his special theory of relativity, his general theory of relativity, and the speculative unified field theory. Other people joined about the same time. One of the more important individuals who joined was of course, Dr. John von Neumann, who was born in Budapest, Hungary, and he came from Europe. He took his degree in mathematics, the PhD in mathematics in 1925, in Budapest. He taught in the German university system for approximately 4 years, at 2 different posts. During that period of the 4 years, he met Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, who was in Europe at that time, who became important later on as to the project, and a number of other people. Now, von Neumann was rather interesting. He was a theoretical man, the theoretical mathematician. But he was also a nuts and bolts man, which means he knew how to apply pure theory. Einstein did not, and this is very important. Now one of the other people turned up at that university, that is where he was teaching at that time, was a very important man, if I can read my notes here, was a man by the name of David Hilbert. Probably none of you have ever heard of David Hilbert. The drive in mathematics, he was considered in Europe as a most outstanding mathematician. He never did leave Europe as far as I know. He was born, raised, and died in Germany. He died in Germany about 1965, approximately. But he was in the circle which drive von Neumann met. Hilbert is most well known and remembered for the fact that he developed a very exotic form of mathematics called Hilbert space. He was the first man to define mathematically multiple realities, multiple space, and what it all meant in the terms of a mathematician's point of view. To the most of us it is almost meaningless, and to the average person it is meaningless, but it was important to the physicist, and to a mathematician, because he laid the groundwork to what became the Philadelphia experiment. Hilbert and von Neumann got together. Von Neumann wrote a paper in Germany, in German, on Hilbert and some of his work, and von Neumann, being a very outstanding man himself, took Hilbert's work and ran with it, as the saying goes, and he developed whole new systems of mathematics of his own. Von Neumann is well known in mathematical circles, as if Hilbert and some of his work has been published, and post-Philadelphia experiment-wise. One of the things he is well known for is game theory. He also developed a system of ring operators, very exotic species of algebra, none of which really means anything except to somebody who is very heavily steeped in mathematics and is a pure mathematician. Other people became important to this project as time went on. Now in 1934 roughly, they moved the project to the Institute, and Dr. Tesla comes into play here. Tesla is a very important man. His history is fairly well known. There is a movie out, by Segretti Productions in Yugoslavia, outlining his life. He was born in 1856. He went to school, to the regular schools, the gymnasium, which is their high school. He started in a university. He was there 1 year when his father died. He ran out of funds, so he could not continue his formal education, but he understudied the professors there, and so he sat in on the classes. He then took work as he could find it, in Europe at Western Union for a period of time. Then he joined the Edison Court of Europe. And when he decided to move to the United States in 1884, he had a letter of introduction from Edison's man, who ran the Edison Court in Europe. So he arrived in the United States in 1884, and as the saying goes, with a good working knowledge of 11 languages, for cents in his pocket, a book of poetry, and a letter of introduction to Thomas Edison. It was most important that he had that letter of introduction, because that became, for a period of time, his mainstay. He was introduced to Edison and immediately got into an argument with Edison over the differences in their basic approach to electricity. Edison was a DC man and Tesla, as was well known, was the AC man, and Edison couldn't see the AC and wanted no part of it. He already had a vested interest, if you will, in the DC machinery which he had designed and built, and in the power systems he was putting together. Well, he worked, that is Tesla worked for Edison for about 6 months. They got into a violent argument over money, namely a promise that was made to Tesla, that if he solved a certain problem, within a certain time deadline, that he, Edison, would give him $50,000 as a bonus. Well, he did the job and finished it, and he came to Edison and asked for his bonus. Edison laughed. Ho ho, that's a big joke, American sense of humor and all of that. Tesla didn't think that was a big joke, and just packed up and left immediately, and went back to digging ditches. After that he met various people, did various things, one of them being for the American president of Western Union. He worked for him for a period of time. That gentleman helped him set up his first laboratory. As time went on, he became an American citizen, and he started to give a series of lectures at the old Institute of Electrical Engineers, which in the 1880s and 1890s was very prominent in New York, and Tesla became a very prominent, regular speaker, on various subjects, of course, involving AC theory, electrical power, and anything else he happened to think was important. With everybody there, their support, everything he presented was important. At one point he gave a demonstration on electrical theory and AC power, and one of the attendees was Mr. George Westinghouse. So in approximately 1889, Westinghouse bought all of Tesla's patents, 20 of them on an AC generator system, and AC power distribution, paid him $1 million cold cash, and a royalty of $1 per horsepower, for every horsepower produced in equipment from that point on, for the life of the patents. This put Tesla in business very thoroughly. In 1893, Tesla won the award for providing the power for the Chicago World Exposition. It was the first time a major exposition had any AC power applied for generation. Previous to that was DC power, when there was power available, and that did not suit Mr. Edison very well, but nevertheless Tesla won it. He was already backed by J.P. Morgan. And he also did something else of great note at that exposition. He demonstrated for the first time, publicly, the model boat, radio-controlled, in the boat basin. He repeated this demonstration in 1898, at another demonstration in Madison Square Garden, New York City. In the meantime there was a contest on for the development of high-power, long-range power transmission, and Tesla won the award to build Niagara Power Station, the first major hydroelectric power station in the United States to be equipped with AC power. He won it because he promised he could ship power all the way to New York City without losses, and he proved it. In 1899, Tesla went to Colorado Springs to do a lot of research, and in this period of the research he was dabbling into very basic areas of research involving very high-powered electricity, electrical volts, the Tesla coil, if you will. He was there 2 years. He made some press announcements. One of them, in 1899, was that he had been in contact with some people off planet Earth, jets, if you will, in our modern terminology. The press took a great deal of note in it, and the scientific colleagues took a very dim view of it, at the time. That was not a popular subject. They thought he was a little bit around the bend perhaps, which they thought very much he was later, a couple of decades later. But he stuck to his guns. Well, in 1906, again with J.P. Morgan's backing, he was going to develop a system for transmission of radio and television signals, and the Wardenclyffe Tower was built on Long Island in 1906. About a year before its completion, he went to J.P. Morgan and said, "Really, Mr. Morgan, I intend to use this tower for the production of free power, for everyone. Free electrical power." And Mr. Morgan said to him, "You mean to tell me, Mr. Tesla, that somebody can stick an antenna rod in the ground, and another one in the air, and pick up all the free power they want, and I can't put the meter on it and charge them?" And Tesla said, "That is correct." J.P. Morgan said, "I will tell you, Mr. Tesla, when I am ready for you." Obviously Mr. Morgan never called him again, cut off all of the funding. The Wardenclyffe Tower sat until 1914 when it was dynamited by someone. And that was the end of that project. Now in the meantime Tesla went on to other things. I will cut this a little bit short, because we are going to get into the main part of this. In 1917 of course there was a war on. World War I. Tesla was approached by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then Secretary of the Navy, to do some work for the government, which he gladly agreed to do. He was also involved at that time with the American Marconi Company, and that company was seized during World War I, as a possible hotbed of alien activity, and you know the usual paranoia that exists during wartime. And the whole company was absorbed by the government, Tesla with it. Tesla did develop a number of interesting things at that time, one of them the Rogers antenna system. The Rogers system for transmission of wireless, which made it possible for the military at that time. The patent was classified for many years, to transmit voice communications to Europe from the United States. without static and without noise, an unheard of feat at that time. The system is still in use today by the military. In 1919 a new corporation was formed, RTA, and Tesla became part of it. It was formed out of the old nucleus of American Marconi. Tesla remained with RTA, first as an engineer, then as a director of engineering, and then after 1935 as the director of all engineering and research worldwide for RTA, which lasted until 1939, at which time he retired. During this entire period of time, he had an impeccable track record for producing hardware that worked and never failed, i.e., he never failed to produce something that worked. He was also well known as a man who visualized these things in his head before he ever put it down on paper, or told somebody what to build, down to the last snapped eyebrow of a dimension. What's important to know this, and to understand that Tesla's approach to the project was largely intuitive, not without a mathematical background, because he had that, but his mathematics was that of the last century, the 1880s. And there was a lot known about electrical theory at that time, but it was not at that time that they developed radio. Hertz got into this in the late 1880s-1890s. Tesla never agreed with Hertz on what a radio wave is. But in 1933, Roosevelt became President of the United States. He called his old friend Nikola Tesla down to Washington, and asked him, "How would you like to do some more work for the government?" And Tesla said, "Fine." And he said, "We have a project for you." He wound up being the director of what would later become known as the Philadelphia Project. And that is basically how Tesla became involved in that project. He was named by the president, so far as what we can determine now. He was the first director. This does show in certain records, and they proceeded. In 1936, there was a first test of some hardware, and this was moderately successful. This means it resulted in some partial invisibility, enough to be encouraging enough to show that they were on the right pathway and the right track, and the Navy became very interested. Actually, they were interested from the beginning in 1931 and provided some research money. And in 1936 they provided more, and the project expanded. Well, this went on and things expanded from that point onward. More people became part of the project. The Drive Gustav Le Bon became a close associate of Drive Juan Neumont, joined the staff. Can't find any record of him today, but nevertheless he was there, and another man, the Dr. Clarkson, joined in approximately in 1940. Now this was not the only project going on at the Institute. There were other people there doing various things. The only man who knew everything that was going on there was of course Dr. Einstein himself. He was considered as the general. If you had a problem, you went to see the general. He was a general consultant to everyone, whatever the project might be. Now this thing continued to grow. I haven't gotten into how I got involved in it yet, didn't quite get into it at this point. I came in later. But I think what I want to do at this point is take a slight break from the theoretical side and show you a videotape, part of it, produced by any foreign corporation of England. This movie was produced basically in 1983, and was released in the United States in 1984 from England to be shown in theaters, with schedule to set up about mid-August of '84. And the movie lasted 2 weeks. About 3 days before the movie was released, Emil Thorne received a letter from the United States government saying, "We don't want this movie to be shown in the United States." They decided after some deliberation to ignore the letter, because they had already made their release dates, and they said, "Well, 3 days we can say that we never got the letter." So they released the movie, and it was shown in various places. New York, Philadelphia. As I understand, there were huge waiting lines to see it, and various other cities around the U.S. Phoenix, Sedona, Hazy, Chicago, Los Angeles, whatever. Another letter arrived at Emil Thorne in England. Shortly thereafter, a very stern, "We don't want this movie shown in the United States." So Emil Thorne could not ignore the second letter. So they fired back at the government, and said, "If you want this movie stopped, you will have to get a court injunction to stop it." And the U.S. government said, "We will," and they did. They got a court order banning the showing of this movie in the United States. That court order took effect sometime early September, and the movie disappeared completely for 2 years. In the meantime, Emil Thorne went ahead and decided that they wanted to fight this, and they did successfully. 2 years later they had a counter-injunction issued, banning the first one, and it again became available as a videotape. I don't believe it has ever been shown in a movie house after that, but the videotape is commonly available. Now the movie, the videotape, The Philadelphia Experiment is the actual title. It is relatively accurate in the first part of the film, and they do embellish it. They want to make a nice interesting movie, the love story, and they distorted some of the parts at the end. Nevertheless, I would like to show the first part of it, because it's very appropriate to what comes from this point on. Mr. Bielek showed a short excerpt of the film, now available from local video stores, called The Philadelphia Experiment. The film starts from the beginning and continues until the two guys jump over the side of the ship. If you have not yet seen this movie, The Philadelphia Experiment, it would be worthwhile to see it. Mr. Bielek continues. Up to that point the story is relatively accurate. They change one thing, the date. It was actually August 12, 1943. And a very disastrous experiment, but a lot happened in between, and this will lead into eventually the rest of the story. Now, as I have said, in 1936 they had the moderate degree of success, but nothing like this. The original intent was to produce a field of invisibility around an object. So they went on working, and in 1940 they did achieve their first real success under Tesla's direction, at the Newfoundland Navy Yard. It was a small ship, which had nobody aboard. The special equipment was put on that ship. It was powered from two adjacent ships on either side, to supply the power on cables. In case something went wrong they could cut the cables, or if they got desperate they could sink the ship. But they didn't have any need to be that desperate. It was precautions, which the Navy always takes. It was completely successful. The small ship became invisible. There was no one on board at this point, because it was a later part of the test. Well, it was declared as a success. The Navy was elated. They felt they had it, and they funded an unlimited amount of money into the research for this thing and classified the project, September of 1940, calling the project, Project Rainbow. Things went into high gear from that point on. Now I think at this point, I should say where I came into it, both myself and my brother. I was born August 4, 1916, in the New York area, to a Mr. Alexander Duncan Cameron, Sr., the father, and a mother who, I don't believe, was married. From what little research we were able to do, had a rather uneventful life, but pleasant life, because there was money in the family. My brother was born in May of 1917, and we went on our merry way. Had a ball as it was, didn't have any worries about money. Came the Depression years. We decided to go to school and get an education. He went to the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, until he graduated in 1939, in the summer of '39 with a Ph.D. in physics. I went to Princeton, bachelor's and master's. I went to Harvard for my doctorate. Earlier, Juan Neumont said, "You don't want to get your doctorate here at Princeton. Go to Harvard, it's a better school." So I took a doctorate out at Harvard. I think it was in August of '39. In the meantime, I should add, there were some other things going in the background, and that background happened to be our father. He himself served in the Navy in World War I. He was a seaman, in the pictures we have in our family album. Exactly when he joined we don't know, and exactly when he left the Navy we don't know. Those papers are missing. But as far as we know, he spent a full 20 years, took his retirement in the very early 30s. And at what rank he left, we don't know, and what connections he made, we don't really know, but he must have made some very interesting connections with intelligence because of what happened from that point on. Now in the 30s. From that point on he never worked a day in his life. By the way, he didn't need to. Now in the 30s he had a hobby, and that was building sailboats. Not little models, but full-sized ones, which he used to race in the various regatta races around Long Island, which was very common then. Take a trophy or two, get tired of the boat, and then sell it, and build another. In the meantime he also became very active in other things. Those other things were smuggling scientists out of Nazi Germany, and bringing them to the United States. That's a long piece of history, and I don't really need to go into. But it ceased in 1939 when the war became hot. In September of 1939, due to the arrangement by my father, who apparently had a great deal of influence in the Navy, had prearranged that we enlist in the Navy, as we both did in September of 1939. We were given commissions. We then went to a special naval training school, in Providence, Rhode Island, for 90 days. We were probably among the earliest of what later they called the 90-day wonders in the Navy. In 90 days you were trained as an officer and were supposed to know everything. Be that as it may, we were then at the end of that in 1939, early 1940. We were assigned to the Institute. Now in the meantime we had had some contact with it, and had been there periodically. I myself had been there for a period of time, because I was at Princeton. But we were assigned to the Institute full board, and our job was to represent the Navy's interest in this project. They wanted two people who had the scientific background and training to be able to accurately report both theoretically and practically on what was going on, what was happening, and what was being done. And that was our main job. We were assigned to the Institute. We also had offices at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Now in 1940, as I have said, there was a successful test. The project was classified. Tesla was given unlimited funding, along with a group which continued to expand. I don't remember all of the people involved, but we had another infrastructure which came into being, the Navy structure. Up to now I largely touched on the civilian end of it. Now there is the Navy end of it. At the very top was the Office of Naval Engineering. In those days they did not have an Office of Naval Research. It was the Office of Naval Engineering. Cal Bowen, Senior Admiral, was in charge. He was not only the overseer for the Navy of this project, but all projects of engineering developmental nature during the war. That office, by the way, was abolished in 1946, and replaced with the Office of Naval Research, which Bowen again was a director of until he retired in 1947. But during that period he was, you might say, the top dog in the Navy. Under him there were some other people. There was a commander established later. I won't go into that, but there was a Lieutenant Commander, ALFRED Bielek, who became sort of the crew chief and took care of the personnel who would to work on the project of invisibility, which then developed into phases. ALFRED Bielek, by the way, is alive today. He's retired from the Navy. He retired as a lieutenant commander. I know him personally. I didn't know for long periods of time there were any survivors, and then suddenly I found out about this gentleman through other friends in New York and talked with him, eventually went to visit him. And he does have memories of essentially all the projects. In fact, he identified me on the phone, on a telephone conversation. He said, "Yes, you worked on that project. I remember you." "No, your name wasn't Bielek." Bielek said, "Well, what was it?" Bielek continued, "I already knew, but I wanted to see if he remembered." He did eventually come up with the name. He remembered my brother. This is all a little to the sides of the main story. Now, one of the other things that had to be done eventually was to develop the special crew. This came a little bit later. January of '41, the Navy decided that my brother and I needed some sea duty, so they transferred us to Oakland Navy Yard, and about a month or so later we were assigned to the Pennsylvania, an old line battle wagon, and we went out into the Pacific. We were out there most of the year of 1941. Along about October of '41, when the Pennsylvania was brought into Pearl Harbor to dry dock for some repairs, we took some leave and eventually went to San Francisco. We had a ball in San Francisco in those days, but we were there during that period of October, late October, early November, and in November it was finally decided that we go back to Pearl Harbor. Now orders were cut, and on December 5th we were getting on the runway for the aircraft at the Naval Air Station to be sent back to Pearl Harbor when we were intercepted by a captain in the Navy and addressed us by our ranks, and said, "Your orders are canceled. Come with me." We followed him to an upstairs room in the Naval Air Station, and we were met by Owen, Sr., who said, "Gentlemen, your orders have been cancelled. You may as well know that we will be at war with Japan within 48 to 72 hours. We expect them to attack Pearl Harbor. You're much too valuable to send back to Pearl Harbor. You will stay here in the San Francisco area. You can do paperwork. You will be assigned to the Pennsylvania. Its home berth is San Francisco. You can finish out your year's tour here in San Francisco. You will then be returned to the Institute to continue your work. Enjoy it while you may, because there will be no leave time, and there will be nothing but hard work after you're back there." So we did. We enjoyed it. And eventually we went back there in January of '42. But at that point a lot had happened in the meantime. Tesla had been assigned the battleship by a certain friend of his. I think it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the White House. He said, "You may have this ship. Go ahead, make it invisible." There was full confidence that he could do it. So he was proceeding with the building of the hardware. There were several, 3 RF transmitters, 1 main generator I believe, then there were 2. The general plan of attack, without getting highly technical, was a series of magnetic coils driven by these generators which produced a very intense magnetic field, and initially they were wrapped around the hull of the ship. Later this was changed to coils mounted on the deck, 4 of them, and RF field all synchronized with special frequencies and special modulation waveforms developed by Tesla which would produce the field of invisibility. Along about this time I will have to fill in a little bit about Tesla. He made another press announcement, in 1923, about talking with X off-planet, which fell on some interested ears, but a lot of dead ears also. and he maintained a stance that he was in communication with us. Now after he retired from RCA, plus he became more active in this project, but he also maintained a laboratory in his living quarters at the Hotel New Yorker, in New York, the top floor. He had another laboratory in New York, which was actually separate, but not a very important one. Unknown to most people, he had a second laboratory which apparently was his main one on top of the Waldorf Astoria on the top floor and both penthouse towers. He maintained a transmitter setup on the Waldorf, and his receiving setup, his receiving antennas and receivers which had been built by RCA under his direction, were on the New Yorker. And I know two people who said they were working with Tesla during that period, that he was using that equipment. He was talking with somebody virtually every day, and one of them was emphatic. It was someone off planet. In plain language, he was communicating with us. Who? I have no idea. It has never been revealed. But during that period he got some additional information and he suddenly went to the Navy and said, "We are going to have a personnel problem. We're going to have a very serious problem. You cannot develop the amount of power necessary to make a large ship of the line invisible without having effects on the personnel. I need more time. I need to develop countermeasures for this so that the personnel are not harmed." The Navy said, "You can't. You've got a deadline date. There's a war on. Make it work. You can fix it, but don't change it. Make it work." In other words, there was a deadline date, which happened to be March of '42. The specific task approached. He became very uneasy about it, and finally decided, with no extension in time and no way that he could modify the hardware to correct the problem, there was only one out for him. And that was to sabotage the equipment, not by physically destroying it, but making certain that it would never work when it was turned on, which was in essence what he proceeded to do on this test date, March of '42. The battleship did not have a special crew on. It had the regular crew, although it had the specialized equipment. And the switches were thrown and nothing happened, and Mr. Tesla bowed out. He said, "Well, gentlemen, the experiment is a failure and it's time for me to leave. There's a very good man here that can take over and make things work for you. And that's Dr. John Juan Neumont." As the story goes, he was fired. There's another story and it goes, "You can't fire me. I quit." Whatever the case, he left. There was some other interest, and he did do other research from that point on until the date of his death, January 7, 1943, which figured into some of the other things that happened later, but was not directly related at that time to the experiment. Now in the period of that era a lot of other projects were afoot. One of the others that was developed and was actually functional prior to this project, and it was the work being done basically at the Navy Yard, and also at the Institute under Einstein's specific direction, was the experiments in the bouncing. I don't know how many of you know it, but prior to World War II and during World War II, actually dating to 1938, the Germans developed a new type of mine, called a magnetic mine. It did not explode by contact. It exploded by means of detecting the magnetic mass of the steel hull of a ship as it approached. It distorted the Earth's magnetic field, and this was sensed by sensing elements on this mine, and when it was close enough to the ship or was underneath the ship, without any contact being made, the trigger mechanisms fired. The mine would go off and blow a hole in the bottom of the ship, and that was the end of the ship. The U.S. Navy knew about this, and they wanted to develop countermeasures, which they did. They were very successful. They were so successful in fact that the Germans gave up on the magnetic mine in 1943, and went back to the standard mines which you cannot effect by this type of equipment. The earlier forms of that equipment involved wrapping 2 sets of cables around the ship, special generators aboard ship. There was no intent to produce invisibility, radar or otherwise. It was strictly a matter of exploding those German magnetic mines. They did explode a lot of them. They saved quite a few ships as a result of it, and that project was entirely successful. I think at this point we'll set up the slides. That this Mr. Bielek shows some slides of the college at Princeton. These slides include area sites of the school, i.e., the room from where he was taught, the inner courtyard, a few trees, and other items around the school. But he also showed the slide of the building where they first conducted the experiment of making things invisible, optically invisible. Mr. Bielek produced other slides of the original equipment from the Philadelphia experiment, from the Eldridge, the ship from which the experiment had taken place. Few of the slides were of one of the special generators and controls. He also mentioned that he knew that this equipment actually came from the Eldridge, because of the feeling or the vibes of being around this equipment. And Mr. Bielek continues, "Okay, once the experiment failed insofar as Tesla's effort was concerned, Drive von Neumann took over. Now some of the other people in the background that became part of this project are well known. One of them is T. Townsend Brown. He has a long history. Many people know him for the fact that he worked in the USO field with electrostatics, attempting to prove that you can make an object move by means of very high voltage of electrostatic fields. And he did a lot of work and is well documented, well researched. He worked in his school days with a Dr. Brown. He became known as Dr. Bifield, the Bifield-Brown effect. Eventually he was picked up by the Navy. He joined the Naval Reserve in 1933 and took part in various little projects. In 1939 they tapped him on the shoulder for active service, and he went in the Navy. And they gave him the project of developing countermeasures for mines. And that was his department basically. You had a number of areas of expertise. He worked on the magnetic mine project. He was also considered an RF expert, so he also worked on the Philadelphia experiment, at least to the extent of designing a special radio transmitter, and a tower to support the antennas, which was the high tower on the Eldridge which figures later, and is shown in the movie, and which was accurate, that it was broken, and it did come down. That was his candid work, not the breaking of it, but the original mounting and testing of it. Before Drive von Neumann could complete his work he told the Navy, "I've got to restudy this thing. Obviously it didn't work. I've got to go back and find out why." And he needed a lot of time. The Navy had no choice but to give whatever time he demanded. So it went on in 42 through a good part of 42 and more theoretical study. Along about May of 42, they decided they were going to need a special ship. The battleship was no longer available. It went back into service. They decided they wanted to build a test vehicle from the ground up. So along about June or July they decided to go to the drawing boards to find out what ships were coming down the ways that might be suitable, that were going to be built, and they picked on D-173, which later was christened the Eldridge. It was not known at that time by that name. And in July they modified the drawings, decided where they wanted the 2 generators. The reason why they had to do the modification was the destroyer, the D, was a rather small ship. Its normal displacement was around 1,500 tons, not 30,000. Consequently they had to fit the equipment, which was quite heavy, very carefully. What they decided to do was to leave the forward gun turret off, and fill it in, and to leave a hole there, and the hole was for where the generators would go. So they mounted the two generators down in the hole where the turret would have normally been, the powder magazine and everything else. The motor drive for the generators, the diesel-electric system to drive the entire system, and for transmitters were eventually mounted on the deck. But the ship had to be built first. It came down the wave about October of '42 and then it went to dry dock, but it started outfitted with various pieces of equipment. So along about January of '43 it was virtually ready. Now insofar as the human equation was concerned, what they were going to do for a crew, about June or so of '42 they decided they were going to have a special crew. All volunteer, handpicked, who would probably, and as they did, essentially sign their lives away. They were volunteers. They would not be responsible, so on and so forth, and they were told that it was going to be a very exotic experiment and there was some danger possibly involved. Do you want to volunteer? Well, they got the kind of people they wanted, about 33, and they went through a special training school at Groton, Connecticut, the Coast Guard Academy. About 3 months of training. Graduated in December of '42, and who was the head of the class, the instructor as it were, whose photos, as well as the entire graduating class showed up. This is still in the family files, believe it or not, was our father, in his naval uniform. How he got back into the Navy, we don't know, unless it was a Coast Guard uniform, but it looked to me like a Navy uniform. And all the enlisted personnel, including 2 warrant officers, they were then, as you might say, swept off to Philadelphia where they were assigned, not knowing of course when the ship would be ready. And they remained on call until they were needed. Those 33 went through, approximately, went through special training, and they were warned of certain things, but nobody expected what actually happened. Since a special crew was available, the ship was being outfitted in January and the was going on and some tests began, about January of '43, separate systems. Nothing was ever tested completely together. It could not be because that was the final test. So various subsystems were tested, the generators, the RF transmitters. Tesla used 3, Von Neumann went to 4 and he finally decided the power of the transmitters selected by Tesla, which were General Electric. The 500 kilowatts VW was not sufficient. He put boosters on them to raise each one to 2 megawatts VW and the 2 generators remained essentially the same, 75 kVA each. Fairly low frequency, motor-driven, special synchronizing circuits to make sure the 2 generators were in absolute sync, otherwise it wouldn't work. A special generator system was built with another very exotic device. It was inherited directly from Tesla, and that was the zero-time reference generator. Now what is a zero-time reference? This is a term you won't see in the textbooks. It is a system which quite simply locks to the Earth's field, the Earth's magnetic structure, and also its mass resonance to a very ingenious system designed by Tesla. Now all the planets in our system and all of the planets throughout this galaxy are basically locked in a cosmology and having what you call a zero-time reference, which is the geocentric center of our galaxy. Everything has to be referenced to this zero-time point. It's a reference relay. Regardless of the local time, you must reference to this thing to make everything work. And Tesla found the means to do this rather simply. These reference generators exist in every FAA system ever built for the glide slope sick. Our landing systems, and it was part of the system. All of the generators, most generators like the one I showed you, and various other equipment. The final version, some 3,006 L6 tubes were used to drive the field coils of the two generators, and that was an accurate rendition, by the way, perhaps not to the exact position, but actually in the sense that there were a large number of tubes, about 3,000 by count. Along about March of 43, Juan Neumann started to get the shades. He would not believe Tesla at first, and Tesla kept saying, "There's going to be a personnel problem," and he wouldn't believe it. Well, my brother and I believed Tesla, because we had a great deal of respect for him, and my brother went through some of the math and the equations and the things that Tesla told him, and I did too. We finally agreed with Tesla, and we kept telling Juan Neumann that you can't turn this system on the way to island, you're going to have a problem. Even Tesla said so. Well, at the mention of Tesla's name, Juan Neumann at that stage would blow up, and he became very upset at the mere mention of his name. Eventually, however, he got the message. He said, "Maybe there will be a problem. Well, let's see what we can do about it." He decided to add a third generator. So they designed and built one and added it about late April, early May. At this point I'm not really sure where they put it. It might have been on deck. It might have been below deck, because it didn't stay very long. They had problems, very serious problems, in that they could never synchronize it to the other two. Along about the same time, early 43, a third man, my brother and I, were the ones chosen to run the equipment, by the way, and were trained to run the entire system because we knew what the system was, and we had the educational background to appreciate what he was trying to do. But as the film showed, and this was correct, we were in enlisted men's uniforms. We had first-class specialist rating, and when we were around the rest of the crew, we wore enlisted men's uniforms because we were working with the crew most of the time. In those days there was a very strong caste system in the Navy. New officers did not mix with the men very well, other than to give them orders. You didn't work with them like that in the uniform in those days. They do now, and on the subs they do. But we were told to wear enlisted men's uniforms when we were working with the crew and in the test mode for the ship. The third man was given to us, a man by the name of Jack, and he was a technician of sorts. He was a first-class electronic technician, had the right background, and he was just a helper. Along about June, mid-June, in one of the tests, this third generator went slightly berserk. Started generating enormous sparks. Jack was hit by one of these arcs and was laid out on the catwalk, cold. We thought maybe he was dead, and the medics came in and hauled him off. He was in a coma. Stayed in the for about 4 months and recovered later. He was never again a part of the project. So Juan Neumann looked at this and said, "The generator is no good. Remove it." It was removed and went back to the two generators. He scratched his head, went back to square one. Well, what do we do now? Decided to go on. The Navy of course was pressuring him in the meantime. "You've got to get this thing going." They did a lot further testing. Eventually early July, actually late June, they decided the ship long since came out of dry dock, and was sitting that dockside in the Philadelphia Navy Yard. We, by the way, had an office in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, in the top of one of the buildings. High security, with a view of the harbor. They decided that the Eldridge was to go to sea for sea trials, which was normal. So it spent 3 days at sea. Mid-June, it came back, had the shakedown. Everything was all right. It did not take the special crew out for this. It took a normal crew out. And it came back. Everything was fine. Went to dockside for final test. Finally, July 20th, they decided the ship was ready for the final testing. So the special test crew was assembled. The captain who was to handle the ship, a man by the name of Hengel, Captain Hengel, the Navy captain, went on board. He was not the permanent captain. Everyone went on board on the 22nd, including ourselves. As the movies showed, the ship went out to its position, its station in the harbor. At 0900 hours we were told to throw the switch, the whole series of them really. There were at that point only 2 generators left, so the movie was slightly inaccurate in that respect. So they turned it on and the ship became invisible, according to the observers. They left it in that mode for some 15 to 20 minutes. They said turn it off, and we turned the equipment off. Bring the ship back to port, and we did. And it was only then when we got it back to port we realized there was a serious problem. The personnel, those that were above deck, there were some above deck and some below deck, were totally disoriented, nauseous, throwing up, almost to the point of delirious and obviously not with it. So the Navy saw the state of affairs. They said get the crew off and we will get you a new crew. Juan Neumann knew for sure then that we had a personnel problem, and he went to the Navy and said, I need more time to study this problem. We need to find out what to do to correct it. The Navy said, you have a drop-dead date of the 12th of August, 1943. You will do the testing by then or forget it. They would not give him a reason why.